None of the packs hindered my draw cycle or the shot in any way. The wider shoulder straps on the ALPS created more tension than any other pack during the draw cycle, but once I reached full dry, I was able to shoot just fine. I filled each backpack with a sleeping bag to help it retain its shape. I then placed paper towels between the bag itself and the sleeping bag to be able to judge how much water soaks through the fabric and into the paper towels. If the backpack had a lid, I filled a Ziploc bag with air to retain the lid shape and put paper towels between the Ziploc bag and the lid fabric. At 3 minutes, the KIFARU was damp right by the edge of the zipper but dry everywhere else. At 8 minutes, the top crease where lid folds over and the upper half was damp, but the lower half was dry. And at 13 minutes, the top was wet, the middle was damp, and the bottom of the main bag had water pooled in it. At 3 minutes, the lid was dry, the face was slightly damp at the top where the zipper is, but dry everywhere else. At 8 minutes, the lid had one small damp spot, everywhere else was dry. The lower third of the main bag and the top portion of the zipper was damp, but the middle was still dry. And at 13 minutes, the water soaked completely through the lid, and the main bag, the top where the zipper is, was damp, the lower half was wet, and there was water pooled in the bottom. The Sitka. At 3 minutes, everything was still dry. At 8 minutes, it was wet in the lower third, but still dry everywhere else. And at 13 minutes, the lower half was wet, and a very small pool was starting to form. At 3 minutes, the lid was still dry. There was a small amount of water that seeped in along the zipper, but everything else was still dry on the main bag. At 8 minutes, the lid was wet on the front, but still dry on the top. The main bag, it was wet along both zippers on the face of the bag, but dry in the middle. The bottom lower third of the bag was wet. At 13 minutes, the lid top was dry, but the front was completely wet. The upper half of the main bag, where the lid was helping shed the water, remained dry, but the lower half of the bag was wet. However, there was no water pooled in the bottom. At 3 minutes, it was damp along the zipper on the very top, but dry everywhere else. At 8 minutes, the top portion of the bag was more saturated than it was at the 3-minute mark. The middle remained dry and the lower third was damp. At 13 minutes, the top was wet, front was slightly wet, the bottom was wet, and there was a small pool of water in the bottom of the bag. At 3 minutes, the top portion of the bag was damp right where both connection points were sewn in, and damp at the bottom. At 8 minutes, it was wet towards the top, damp along the entire zipper, and had water pooled in the bottom. At 3 minutes, the main bag was damp down the zipper and damp down the entire front of the bag. At 8 minutes, the zipper and face were wet and there was a big pool of water in the bottom. At 3 minutes, the lid was wet along the zipper and damp everywhere else. The main bag was completely dry. At 8 minutes, the lid was completely soaked through and starting to pool. The main bag was wet along the zipper edge and lower third of the bag was damp. At 13 minutes, the lid had pooled water in it. The top of the main bag remained dry, but was wet along the main zipper. The lower third was wet, and there was a small pool forming in the bottom of the main bag. Bag 1, 80.4. Bag 2, 79.2. The rigid frame on the KIFARU supported the 160-pound load well and held it securely. The hip belt stayed up on my hips and distributed the weight evenly. Zero noise came from the frame, buckles, or fabric. The X-curve frame supported and secured the 160-pound load well. The hip belt tried to stay on my hips, but the lumbar section slid down and was resting on the top of my butt. Zero noise came from the frame, buckles, or fabric. The frame and design of the load panel secured and supported the load well. The design of the hip belt cut my hips but still slid down a bit in the lumbar area and rested on top of my butt. Zero noise came from the frame, buckles, or fabric. The 160-pound load was supported and secured by the frame and straps well. The hip belt stayed on my hips and the large lumbar pad did a good job keeping the pack from sliding onto the top of my butt. Zero noise came from the frame, buckles, or fabric. The design of the load panel secured the 160-pound load well, and the frame did its job supporting the weight. The hip belt stayed up on my hips, but the lumbar section slid down and rested on top of my butt. Zero noise came from the frame, buckles, or fabric. The frame on the Mystery Ranch supported and secured the 160 pounds well. The hip belt slid off my hips and rested on my hip flexors and on top of my butt. I think this is mostly due to the point of my hips hitting the gap between the sides of the hip belt and the lumbar portion. As for noise, there was a squeak coming from the pack as I walked with the weight. The ALPS secured the load well, with side flaps and a bottom flap, plus the frame supported the load. The hip belt slid down off my hips and rested on my hip flexors and the top of my butt. Zero noise came from the frame, buckles, or fabric. The Blacks Creek secured the load well with side flaps and a bottom flap, and the frame supported the weight. The hip belt stayed on my hips, but the lumbar pad slid down and rested on top of my butt. Zero noise came from the frame, buckles, or fabric.